Good evening. I'm Chris Turner, and I am going to talk to you this evening about the global energy transition. And in particular, I am going to talk about the pace of the global energy transition, which makes this inevitably a conversation about the future. When we talk about this transition, we tend to talk about targets and rates of change, about what's happening in 2030 and 2050. And so what winds up happening is we tend to imagine futures that are much simpler than this crazy, complex present that we all live in. It's a bit like old school science fiction, if you'll bear with me. It tends to channel itself into two very different and equally simplistic and inaccurate models of the future. This is the first version. You remember that cheesy, old school sci-fi future? Everything's clean and white and gleaming. We're all in matching jumpsuits, color-coded by occupation. Our ultimate target in this energy transition is somewhere as close to zero emissions as we can get, as fast as we can get. And so that tends to lead to a sort of jumpsuit thinking, you know? Fossil fuels have been banished, everything's clean and green, Mr. Spock is talking to humpback whales, all that stuff. And so if that is, you know, the upside of our energy transition, the downside must be its opposite, right? That must be the other option. Fail to act, don't move fast enough, and it's hellish desert landscapes and roadside cannibalism for the lot of us. Now, I'm not going to talk very much tonight about these hellscapes, but I'm sure you've all seen enough, recent weather disaster news that it needs no further explanation or introduction. But when has the world ever been that simple? Isn't it more likely that whatever that future looks like, it's going to look a lot like the current mess plus some weird set details? Now, this, by the way, is Marty McFly of the Back to the Future movies in 2015, and it was conceived about 30 years ago. It's not perfect. It didn't get it exactly right, but it is actually a whole lot closer than jumpsuits, a whole lot closer than hellscapes to what we actually live in. And so 30 years from now, isn't the world way more likely to look like the same old mess plus a hoverboard or two? Isn't that kind of a more plausible scenario? Even if things do go much worse for us than they did for Marty McFly, even still, even if it's a dark, rainy, kind of Blade Runner kind of landscape, odds are you'll still be able to at least get a decent bowl of soup. It will be, there will be a recognizable human existence in there somewhere. My point here is that it does matter how we talk about the energy transition and about where it's going. And as that transition becomes unstoppable, it matters that we try to avoid this kind of hyperbole, this kind of simplistic thinking. It won't be matching jumpsuits. It probably won't be Mel Gibson in the desert. So let's try to get it right. Now, I am a little bit guilty of what you might call matching jumpsuit thinking. I have written 2 books on this global energy transition from the very early days when it felt necessary to describe this very rosy future. 8-10 years ago when I was first working on it, it seemed like we needed a bit of hype. But we've come a long way in 10 years, and we maybe don't need quite as much hype anymore. And in the meantime, I've been writing a lot about the hard, complex part of this transition. These aren't hellscapes in these books. These are stories much more about people who are wary of the enormous amount of uncertainty about abandoning the status quo for something new, and that's totally understandable. This energy transition we're in the midst of now is huge. It will take decades. It can seem scary, and it's okay to talk about it that way. Because the thing is, it can cause problems to talk too much about the matching jumpsuit future. It can make it really hard to understand where we actually are in the energy transition and how fast we are going. And that it will take some really, really hard choices and concessions and trade-offs to get where we want to go. I mean, just consider all this. You look at all this stuff, don't try to read them all. On one level, this is hugely exciting. This transition I'm talking about is clearly well underway now. It's going faster than anyone expected even a few years ago, and it does feel inevitable now, and that's awesome. But, in all that excitement, the hype and conjecture can get mixed up with the truth, and this is one example of this. I was touring the country last fall, talking about the oil sands, talking about my book about the oil sands, and everywhere I went, people wanted to talk about this one study that said there'd be no more gas-powered cars in like 10 years. And so what's the big deal about that? What's the risk in that? Well, I was on a panel at one point, and there was this very well-regarded political thinker on the panel with me, and he's telling the crowd, Canada shouldn't be doing a thing in terms of investment in its oil and gas infrastructure because we'll all be driving electric cars in 10 years. And said it that baldly, like no qualifications, this is happening, folks. And I suddenly was the guy going, wait a minute, that's one study. It's not even a very good study, frankly. And that's just the danger of jumpsuit thinking, is it makes the process look way too easy, way too fast. And if I were to move on deeper into the Canadian context today, we'd soon be talking about oil sands and LNG terminals and carbon taxes and all that stuff, and I bet we'd soon be at each other's throats and not listening to each other anymore. We might lose sight of the point I want to make about the pace of energy transitions and the messiness of energy transitions. So let's go to some neutral ground instead. Let's all go to Costa Rica just for a minute. Why? Well, it's a great time of year to go to a place like Costa Rica, for one thing. But much more than that, it is one of those jumpsuit places. Costa Rica has become one of these places we point to and say, we could solve this thing, in a decade if we wanted to. And the reason we say that about Costa Rica is because they have, in fact, almost entirely eliminated fossil fuels from their grid. 100% renewables almost on their grid, and certainly for days on end, that's all they use. But that is relatively easy to do in a small, not very heavily industrialized nation that gets a ton of rain, is extraordinarily hilly. Converting all that to hydropower was not some sort of grand, generation-long energy transition. That said, it is a genuine accomplishment. You can understand that Costa Ricans want to brag a little bit about it now. But even then, I think it is important to get the details right. This, for example, is what greets you at the airport in the capital of San Jose. Alongside the fact that they have no military, they're now saying 100% renewable energy runs this country. And it's like, hold on, guys, 100% renewable energy runs your grid. You are not 100% renewable in everything you do. In fact, 70% of your emissions now come from the transport sector. And the transport sector is a mess in Costa Rica, and here's why. This is, if you don't know it, this is what Costa Rica looks like. Pretty much 3/4 of the population all jammed into that central valley there that you can see. And basically, every single day, business as usual looks a lot like this. There is not a single non-internal combustion engine way to get around in any kind of significant number in Costa Rica. And so when they're talking about 100% renewables, they're not talking about how they're driving. Now, to be fair, because they are a progressive country, they have begun to look into what would, a 100% green transportation future look like, and they went and built themselves a nice little commuter train system. And so I was there recently and decided, let's check out how the train system's going. It's quite cheap. You can get a ticket, and you can take the train. And there is, let me be clear, a train. This is where they've gotten to 12 years down the line. They started working on this in 2005, starting to think through their traffic problem. They have a single line. It goes from a number of suburbs into the city center and back again. It's almost literally just a single train back and forth. Doesn't go very fast. Doesn't go very, very pleasantly, but they do, in fact, have a train. Now, the thing about this is the hard part for them. This is the extraordinarily difficult part. They've set targets for electric vehicles and the rest of it, but the really heavy lifting, if you're in Costa Rica, is going to be solving this dependence on private automobiles, private buses, basically all the stuff that we know is kind of the wrong way to go at solving a transport problem in this energy transition. Now, if you talk to the Costa Rican government, they'll say, they're planning to build more LRTs and the rest of it, but in the meantime, this is as far as they've gotten. They've got one train, and then they have this mess. And that is, this is not matching jumpsuit terrain. In fact, this is the sole available infrastructure for getting on and off the train in the middle of the largest city in Costa Rica. And the reason it still looks like this is because they've already done the low-hanging fruit. They are now into the really, really hard part of the energy transition, and that's going to be the tough part. And people are going to fight, and they're not going to like some of the choices. If you want to draw any analogies between their situation and Canada's relationship with its oil and gas sector, I would not dissuade you from doing that. Thank you.